October 12, 1944. A military transport truck rumbled through the gates of Camp Huntsville, Texas, carrying cargo that would shatter every expectation the American guards had about their enemy. Inside sat 43 German women, members of the Wehrmacht's auxiliary services, captured during the Allied advance through France. They were exhausted, terrified, and bracing themselves for the horrors their propaganda had promised awaited them in American captivity. As the canvas covering was pulled back, revealing the women to their American captors, what happened in the next 60 seconds would become a moment of such profound culture shock that it would be retold for generations. A single whispered joke that would crack open years of indoctrination and change everything both prisoners and guards thought they knew about each other. Before we discover the joke that broke through years of propaganda, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. These 43 women had been captured across France during the summer of 1944. They weren't combat soldiers, but they had been essential to the German war effort as radio operators, telephone switchboard attendants, and administrative clerks. For weeks after their capture, they had been held in temporary facilities in France, then shipped across the Atlantic in cramped conditions. During this entire journey, they clung to what they had been told about Americans. The propaganda had been consistent and specific. Americans were physically weak, morally corrupt, and would treat German prisoners with cruelty and disrespect. 22-year-old Greta Schneider clutched a small cloth bag containing everything she owned as she prepared to step down from the truck. Inside was a worn photograph of her family in Berlin, a prayer book from her mother, and an embroidered handkerchief. These simple items represented everything familiar in a world that had become completely foreign. As a radio operator in occupied France, she had believed every word she'd been told about defending the fatherland from weak, decadent Americans. Greta had grown up in Berlin, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a postal worker. When the call came for women to serve, she volunteered without hesitation. The propaganda had been specific. American soldiers were soft, undisciplined, and physically inferior to German troops. Capture would mean certain abuse and humiliation. She braced herself for the worst as her feet touched Texas soil. What she saw instead made her freeze mid-step. Standing in formation before the truck were the American guards assigned to the women's compound. At the front stood Sergeant Mike O'Reilly, a former Chicago steelworker who towered at 6 feet 4 inches and 230 pounds of solid muscle. Beside him was Private Tommy Wilson from Alabama, 6 feet 2 inches and built like the farm equipment he'd operated before enlisting. Corporal James Henderson from Minnesota looked like he could bench press the transport truck itself. These weren't the malnourished, weak Americans from the propaganda posters. These were giants, well-fed, powerfully built, and radiating the casual confidence that came from physical capability. The entire formation presented the same picture. They were tall, broad-shouldered, healthy, and strong. Behind Greta, 20-year-old Liesel Hoffman whispered in German, her voice trembling. "They're enormous." The propaganda never mentioned this. The murmurs spread through the prisoners like wildfire. If their leaders had lied about something this obvious, what else had been a lie? The American guards were objectively, undeniably massive compared to what they had been told to expect. But it was 19-year-old Frida Klein who shattered the tension in the most unexpected way. Staring at Sergeant O'Reilly with wide eyes, she whispered to the women around her, "I thought Americans were supposed to be weak and small. That one could probably use me as a toothpick." Despite their fear, several women let out nervous laughs. The absurdity was too much. The complete contradiction between what they'd been told and what stood before them demanded some release. That laughter was their first act of rebellion against everything they'd been taught. A tiny crack in the wall of lies that had shaped their entire understanding of the world. The morning of October 13th brought more shocks. Breakfast presented generous portions of eggs, bread, and even fruit. Many hadn't seen such abundance in months. But here, in what they had been told was a weak and failing country, they were being fed better than they had eaten in years. As they ate, guards rotated through on patrol, and the whispered observations continued. Frida gestured subtly toward Corporal Henderson. "That one looks like he wrestles bears for fun." Private Tommy Wilson noticed something strange. The German prisoners kept looking at the guards, then whispering with expressions that didn't match his expectations. They didn't look angry or defiant. They looked almost amused. Tommy had never been outside Alabama before joining the army. He'd been told to expect hardened Nazi sympathizers, cold and hostile. Instead, these women kept stealing glances and turning away quickly, their shoulders shaking with laughter. During shift change, Tommy approached Sergeant O'Reilly. "Sarge, I think something's going on. They keep looking at us funny. Do you think they're planning something?" The sergeant studied the women's behavior. "Wilson, I don't think they're planning an escape. I think they're laughing at us." Tommy's confusion deepened. "Laughing at us? Why?" O'Reilly explained. "They think we're big. Real big, apparently." The breakthrough came on October 15th during a work detail in the camp laundry facility. Frida whispered to Greta about how the sergeant had to duck to fit through the doorway. "He must hit his head on everything. Imagine him in a normal German house with our ceilings." Greta let out an unintended snort of laughter. O'Reilly's head turned sharply toward the sound. The women immediately fell silent. For a long moment, the sergeant simply watched them. Then he smiled. "You know," he said in slow, clear English, "I can tell when someone's talking about me, even in German." Frida, mustering her courage and limited vocabulary, looked up at the towering sergeant. "You are very tall," she said in heavily accented English. "We are surprised." The simple honesty made O'Reilly laugh, a genuine, warm laugh. The sergeant crouched down, bringing himself closer to eye level. "Where I come from in Chicago, this is normal size. Many men are tall. Were you told Americans were small?" Greta nodded hesitantly. "Yes. Propaganda say Americans are weak, small, not strong." O'Reilly's smile faded, replaced by something more thoughtful. "Well," he said gently, "I guess propaganda lies to both sides." The simplicity of that statement hung in the air. It was an acknowledgement that both Germans and Americans had been fed false information about each other. For the first time since their capture, the German women felt something shift. Not quite trust, but perhaps the very beginning of understanding. November 23, 1944 brought Thanksgiving Day. The camp commander authorized a special meal and decided to include the German prisoners. Nothing could have prepared the women for what appeared on their plates. Turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes with gravy, cranberry sauce, green beans, rolls with butter, and pumpkin pie. More food than most had seen in a single meal in years. Liesel stared at her overflowing plate with disbelief. "This is for prisoners? What do they feed their own soldiers?" Frida simply began eating with enthusiasm. "If this is prison, maybe we've been on the wrong side." After the meal, guards organized an impromptu recreation period. Private Wilson brought a football and found himself trying to explain American football to curious German women. "Why is it that shape?" Greta asked. Wilson realized she meant soccer. Sergeant O'Reilly joined in, tossing the football in a gentle spiral. "You throw it like that always?" Frida asked. O'Reilly nodded and offered her the ball. "Want to try?" Taking the football awkwardly, Frida attempted to throw it. The ball tumbled end over end, traveling barely 10 feet. Wilson jogged over and spent several minutes showing her the proper grip and throwing motion. Soon half a dozen German women were attempting to throw the strange American ball, their throws growing slightly less awkward with each attempt. The guards offered tips and encouragement, falling naturally into the role of coaches rather than captors. In that moment, under the Texas autumn sun, enemies became simply people trying to understand each other's strange customs. December brought a significant shift in the camp's atmosphere. The initial jokes about the guard size had evolved into real conversations. One afternoon, Greta approached Sergeant O'Reilly in the camp library. "Sergeant, may I ask something? When we arrive here, we are told Americans are small, weak people. Not like what we see. Why do they lie to us about something so easy to see is not true?" O'Reilly pulled up a chair. "Because if they lie about small things, you don't question the big lies. If you believe Americans are weak, you believe Germany can win easily. You don't ask hard questions about the war." Greta's expression was troubled. "What else is lies?" The sergeant's face grew somber. That's something you'll have to figure out yourself. But I can tell you we were lied to about Germans too. We were told you were all monsters, all evil. He looked directly at her. You're not monsters. You're just people. Young people who got caught up in something bigger than you understood. That evening, Greta gathered several women in their barracks. After lights out, she shared her conversation with O'Reilly. Liesel raised the question that terrified them all. If they lied about Americans being weak, what about everything else? What about the reasons for the war? Frida was uncharacteristically serious. I've been thinking about this since Thanksgiving. They feed prisoners better than Germany fed its soldiers toward the end. What kind of weak, failing country does that? The women wrestled with cognitive dissonance that was both painful and liberating. Anna Vogel finally spoke. Maybe the worst lie was telling us that questioning was wrong, that doubt was weakness. Maybe that's how they kept us from seeing truth. January 9, 1945 brought news that would shatter whatever remained of the women's illusions. American forces had begun discovering concentration camps, documenting everything they found. Camp Huntsville received newsreels meant for German prisoners as part of a re-education program. The women filed into the recreation hall, confused. Captain Warren stood before them with deep seriousness. What you are about to see is difficult, but it is true. This is what the Reich did in your name. The lights dimmed, and the newsreel began. Within minutes, the hall filled with sobbing and gasping. Images of Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, and other camps flickered across the screen. Skeletal survivors. Mass graves filled with thousands of bodies. The systematic machinery of death. The women sat frozen, their faces reflecting horror and disbelief. Greta felt her stomach turn violently. She had known the Reich was harsh, but this systematic extermination was beyond anything she had imagined possible. Beside her, Liesel wept openly. Frida sat perfectly still, tears streaming down her face in silence. When the newsreel ended, no one moved. The silence was absolute and crushing. Sergeant O'Reilly approached Greta, who stared at nothing, her face drained of color. This isn't your fault. You didn't know. Finally, she turned to look at him, anguish profound in her eyes. How could we not know? How could this happen in our country and we not know? He had no answer that would comfort her. Sometimes, he said carefully, evil hides itself in words like duty and patriotism. It makes people look away from questions they should ask. That night, the barracks filled with quiet crying. The women who had laughed nervously at the size of American guards 3 months earlier now wept for the millions of victims of a regime they had unknowingly served. The joke about Americans being too large had been the first crack in their indoctrination. A small observation that revealed a larger truth. They had been lied to about everything. By war's end, many of these women would choose to remain in America, building new lives in a country they had once been taught to fear. They would tell their children and grandchildren about that October day in 1944 when they stepped off a truck in Texas expecting monsters and found, instead, just men. Tall men who would help them see the truth. The joke that stunned the American guards wasn't really about size at all. It was about the moment when propaganda met reality and shattered completely. Sometimes the most powerful weapon against lies is simply the truth. Standing 6'4" in a Texas prison camp, offering to teach you how to throw a football. The women of Camp Huntsville learned that propaganda dies when it meets reality. That walls built of lies crumble when touched by simple truth. And that sometimes the enemy becomes a friend the moment you're brave enough to see them as human.